Thomas Mitchell stood in his kitchen, staring at the note on the granite countertop. The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he read it for the 10th time, hoping the words might somehow change. "I need some time. Please don't try to find me. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. Sarah." At 52, Thomas had built what he considered a good life. Their 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs of Seattle provided the stability he'd always wanted. 25 years of marriage to Sarah had given them 2 children, both now in college, and a comfortable routine that felt as natural as breathing. The house was too quiet now. Usually, Sarah would be preparing dinner at this hour, filling the kitchen with the sounds of chopping vegetables and the quiet humming that accompanied her cooking. Instead, there was only the steady drip of the coffee maker he'd left running that morning, each drop echoing in the empty space. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number again. Her cheerful voicemail greeting played in his ear. "Hi, you've reached Sarah Mitchell. Please leave a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Thomas hung up without leaving a message. Her phone was probably sitting in their bedroom, where he'd found it earlier, deliberately left behind. The normality of the Saturday had made everything feel surreal. He'd spent the morning working in the garden while Sarah talked on her phone, stepping into the house periodically for what she called catching up with old friends. These calls had become more frequent over the past few months, but Thomas had attributed it to her recent interest in reconnecting with her high school classmates through social media. Thomas walked through the house, looking for clues he might have missed. Sarah's car was gone from the garage. Her toothbrush was missing from their bathroom, along with some of her clothes and her small travel suitcase. The absence of these items suggested planning, forethought. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. In her home office, he noticed something odd. The printer's paper tray was slightly askew. He pulled it out, finding a receipt caught in the mechanism. It was from a department store in Riverside, dated 3 weeks ago. Thomas frowned. Riverside was nearly 200 miles away. What had Sarah been doing there? As darkness fell outside, Thomas sat in their living room, surrounded by family photos. Sarah's smile looked back at him from dozens of frames, their wedding day, family vacations, graduations. He studied each image, searching for signs he might have missed, some hint of unhappiness or discontent that could explain her departure. Had her smiles grown more distant in recent photos? Were there subtle changes he should have noticed? The clock on the mantel struck 9, and Thomas realized he needed to make some decisions. Emma would call for her usual Sunday check-in tomorrow. Michael might drop by unexpectedly, as he often did when he was home from college. What would he tell them? How could he explain their mother's disappearance when he didn't understand it himself? He reached for his phone again, then stopped. The note had been clear. "Please don't try to find me." Should he respect her wishes, or was this a time when love meant ignoring such requests? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him as he sat in the growing darkness, the carefully constructed routine of his life crumbling around him. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of phone calls and growing anxiety. Thomas contacted Sarah's friends, her sister in Portland, even her elderly aunt in Vancouver. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial concern, followed by awkward silence when he couldn't explain why she'd left. In Sarah's office, he found more troubling signs. Hidden behind her gardening magazines was a folder containing confirmations for a post office box in Riverside. Credit card statements showed small but regular charges at coffee shops and restaurants he didn't recognize, all roughly 200 miles away. The pattern stretched back months, maybe years. He'd never scrutinized their finances this closely before. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but we can't file a missing persons report yet," the police officer explained patiently. "Your wife left voluntarily, and there's no evidence of foul play. The note clearly states her intention to be away for a while." Thomas paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. But something could have happened after she left. She could be in danger now. "Sir, we take these situations seriously, but we have to wait 48 hours. If you haven't heard from her by then, come down to the station and file a report." The conversation with Emma was even harder. "Dad, what do you mean Mom's taking some time? That doesn't sound like her at all. She was fine when I talked to her last week. She was making plans for Thanksgiving. Thomas pressed his fingers against his temples, fighting a growing headache. Honey, I'm sure everything's fine. She just needs a little space. The lies felt bitter on his tongue, but he couldn't bear to worry his daughter unnecessarily. Michael showed up unannounced Wednesday evening, his face tight with concern. Emma called me, he said, stepping into the house. The Seattle rain had followed him in, darkening the shoulders of his jacket. What's really going on? Thomas led his son to the kitchen and showed him the note, along with the receipts and confirmations he'd found. Michael read everything twice, his expression darkening. This isn't like Mom at all. Have you checked her credit cards? Bank accounts? Nothing unusual in our joint accounts, Thomas replied. No large withdrawals, no suspicious purchases. Just the regular bills and groceries from last week. He didn't mention the pattern of charges he'd found in Riverside. Something held him back from sharing that detail, even with his son. You need to hire someone, Michael insisted. A private investigator or something. This isn't right, Dad. Mom doesn't just disappear. Thomas had already considered it, but hearing his son voice the suggestion made it feel more real, more necessary. The next morning, he contacted Jensen Investigations, a firm recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a difficult divorce last year. Linda Jensen was direct and professional. We'll start by checking hotels and rental car agencies in the area. The credit card monitoring is good. Keep that up. We'll also look into her recent internet history, phone records, anything that might give us a direction. She paused, studying Thomas carefully. Sometimes people who disappear like this have been living double lives for years. Have you noticed any irregularities in your finances? Regular trips or unexplained absences? Thomas thought about the Riverside receipts in his pocket, but said nothing. Some truths were too frightening to voice just yet. The breakthrough came exactly 17 days after Sarah's disappearance. Linda Jensen called Thomas at work, her usually composed voice tinged with excitement. We found something. There was an ATM withdrawal yesterday, exactly 200 miles north of your house. The transaction happened at a branch in Riverside. She paused. The same Riverside where those credit card charges were coming from. Thomas felt his throat tighten. 200 miles. The distance seemed to mock him now, each receipt, each charge, each hidden trip marking out the careful geography of deception. He thought about all those Sunday afternoons when Sarah had been visiting friends or taking art classes, measuring the hours against the mile. There's more, Linda continued. We found her car. It's parked at St. Mary's Hospital in Riverside. It's been there for at least 3 days, according to the parking logs. The police are taking this more seriously now. Regular visits to a hospital 200 miles away suggest something systematic. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A hospital. Was Sarah sick? Had she been hiding some terrible diagnosis from him? The possibilities multiplied in his mind, each worse than the last. I'm heading there now, Thomas said, already reaching for his key. Mr. Mitchell, wait, the Riverside PD is already involved. They're sending someone to check the hospital records. Let them do their job. But Thomas couldn't wait. He called Michael, asking him to stay with Emma if she came home for the weekend, then pointed his car north. The drive gave him too much time to think, watching the landscape change from Seattle's lush green to the drier, browner hills around Riverside. 200 miles. How many times had Sarah made this drive? How many hours spent on this highway, rehearsing lies for her return? St. Mary's Hospital loomed against the afternoon sky, a sprawling complex of brick and glass. Thomas found Sarah's silver Volvo exactly where Linda said it would be, covered in a light film of dust. He touched the hood cold. It hadn't moved in days. Inside the car, he found more evidence of Sarah's double life. A gym membership card for a Riverside fitness center, a punch card for a local coffee shop with 8 holes already marked, a parking permit for Cedar Heights townhouses. Each item represented a separate thread in the tapestry of deception she'd woven. The hospital's main entrance felt like a portal to another world. Thomas approached the information desk, his heart pounding. I'm looking for my wife, he said, showing the young volunteer a photo on his phone. Sarah Mitchell. She might be a patient. The volunteer typed something into her computer, then frowned. I'm sorry, sir, we don't have any patients by that name. Could you check again, maybe under a different name? Thomas felt desperation creeping into his voice. She has to be here somewhere. Sir, I can only tell you. That's when he saw her. Sarah was walking down a corridor about 50 feet away, carrying a paper cup of coffee. She looked exactly the same shoulder-length brown hair, same practical shoes, same careful way of walking to avoid spilling her drink. But she was wearing different clothes than the ones missing from their closet, clothes he'd never seen before. A whole separate wardrobe for her other life. She turned into a room without noticing him. Thomas followed, his feet moving of their own accord. He reached the doorway just in time to see Sarah set the coffee cup down next to a hospital bed. In it lay a man Thomas had never seen before, his face pale against the white pillows, tubes snaking from his arms to various machines. Sarah leaned down and kissed the man's forehead with such tenderness that Thomas felt physically ill. It was the same way she used to kiss their children when they were sick. The same gentle touch she'd given him during his bout with pneumonia 3 years ago. Sarah, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She straightened up so quickly she knocked over the coffee cup. Dark liquid spread across the bedside table as Sarah stared at him, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then her eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the floor. The next few hours passed in a blur of hospital staff, police officers, and devastating revelations. Sarah recovered from her fainting spell quickly, but refused to meet Thomas's eyes as she was checked over by a nurse. The man in the bed, they learned, was David Reeves, Sarah's high school boyfriend who had recently suffered a massive stroke. But that was just the beginning of the truth. With gentle but firm questioning from the Riverside police, the full story emerged. David hadn't just been Sarah's high school boyfriend, he'd been her lover for the past 6 years. They had reconnected at a class reunion, and what started as innocent catching up over coffee had evolved into a long-term affair. The townhouse. Linda Jensen said quietly, showing Thomas her tablet. Cedar Heights, Unit 7. It's registered to David Reeves. We found the utility bills. They go back 5 years. The drive to Cedar Heights took exactly 7 minutes from the hospital. Thomas counted them, wondering how many times Sarah had made this same journey. The complex sat on a hill overlooking Riverside, its neat rows of brown buildings so different from their tree-lined street in Seattle. He stood in the tastefully furnished townhouse later that evening, surrounded by evidence of his wife's double life. There were clothes identical to ones in their closet at home, a toothbrush the same brand as the one missing from their bathroom, framed photos of Sarah and David on vacation in places Thomas had never been. In the kitchen, he found a drawer full of takeout menus, each marked with favorite orders and preferences. A shelf in the pantry held the same brands of tea and coffee they kept at home. She'd recreated their domestic life in miniature, 200 miles away. 6 years, he said to the empty room. 6 years of lie. He found Sarah's jewelry box on the dresser, containing duplicates of pieces he'd given her over the years. It was like looking at a bizarre mirror image of their life together. Everything carefully replicated but fundamentally false. The police had more questions. How had he not known? Had there been signs? Money missing from their accounts? Thomas answered mechanically, still trying to process the scope of the deception. Their joint accounts showed no unusual activity because Sarah had a separate account, carefully maintained, for her other life. Back at the hospital, David remained unconscious, unaware of the chaos his condition had caused. Sarah sat by his bed, her face tear-stained but composed. In the harsh fluorescent light, Thomas noticed new things about her, slight changes in how she held herself, in how she spoke. Was this the real Sarah? Or was the woman he'd known for 25 years the real one? Maybe both versions were equally true, equally false. I never meant for you to find out like this, she said when Thomas returned. I was going to tell you after we knew if David would recover. Were you? Thomas asked, surprised by the calmness in his voice. Or would you have gone back home eventually, pretending nothing had happened? Another 200 miles on the odometer? Another story about visiting friends? Sarah's silence was answer enough. The drive home felt infinite. Thomas thought about the significance of that distance now, far enough to feel safe from discovery, close enough to maintain regular visits. The perfect compromise for a double life. Each mile marker seemed to mock him. One more measure of betrayal, one more unit of deception. He thought about their children, about how to tell them their mother had been living a lie for 6 years. He thought about their friends, their neighbors, their family. How many Sunday dinners, Christmas celebrations, and summer barbecues had Sarah attended while carrying this secret? How many times had she sat in Seattle traffic, mentally rehearsing her stories while planning her next escape north? The foundation of his life hadn't just cracked, it had shattered completely. Every memory now required re-examination. Every moment of happiness called into question. Had Sarah been thinking of David during their anniversary dinners? Had she compared them in bed? Had any of it been real? Thomas pulled into their driveway just as dawn was breaking. The house looked exactly the same as when he'd left, but everything had changed. He sat in the car, watching the sun rise over their carefully maintained garden, and wondered how many mornings Sarah had watched the same sunrise in Cedar Heights, in another man's bed, in another version of her life. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 200 days after Sarah's disappearance. Thomas noticed the symmetry as he signed them, his signature steady and decisive on each page. The mediator had been surprised by his lack of anger during negotiations, but Thomas felt beyond anger. What he felt was a deep, pervasive exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones. David Reeves died without regaining consciousness 3 weeks after Thomas's discovery at the hospital. Sarah called to tell him, her voice flat and distant over the phone. Thomas listened to her cry quietly, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow sympathy. He wondered when she had stopped loving him, or if she ever truly had. Perhaps love, like distance, was something that could be carefully measured and divided. Telling the children had been the hardest part. Emma and Michael came home on a rainy Seattle weekend, the kind their mother had always said made her feel melancholy. Now Thomas wondered if those days had actually been spent in sunny Riverside. Emma refused to believe it at first, defending her mother with the fierce loyalty that had always characterized their relationship. But when Thomas showed her the photos from Cedar Heights, her face crumpled. She stopped taking Sarah's calls for months afterward, channeling her hurt into angry poetry and long runs along the waterfront. Michael, more pragmatic, asked detailed questions about finances and living arrangements. He started spending more weekends at home, as if keeping watch over his father, organizing their new life with the same methodical care he applied to his engineering studies. Thomas noticed how his son would sometimes stand in the kitchen doorway, watching him cook dinner, as if afraid he too might disappear. The community's reaction followed predictable patterns. Some neighbors avoided him, unsure what to say. Others brought casseroles, now with divorce lawyers' business cards tucked beneath the aluminum foil. Sarah's sister called to apologize, as if her family's genes were somehow responsible for the betrayal. "I should have known," she said. All those times she said she was visiting friends in Portland. Thomas threw himself into work, taking on additional projects that kept him at the office late into the evening. He sold the house, too many memories haunted its rooms, and bought a modern apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and no trace of suburban domesticity. From his 20th floor balcony, he could see the highway stretching north toward Riverside, a gray ribbon disappearing into the distance. He found Sarah's old running shoes in a moving box, still caked with red Riverside clay. She must have forgotten to pack them that last time. Thomas stood in his new kitchen, holding them, realizing he no longer knew which life had been the real one, their carefully maintained Seattle existence, or her secret life 200 miles away. Perhaps both had been equally real, equally false. 6 months after signing the divorce papers, Thomas found himself having coffee with Claire, a landscape architect working on one of his projects. She was divorced too, with grown children and no interest in marriage. Their conversation felt easy, natural, without the weight of expectations or measurement. "How did you know you were ready to date again?" he asked her over their second coffee meeting. Claire considered the question carefully. "When I stopped trying to solve the puzzle of my marriage," she said finally. "When I accepted that some questions don't have answers, and some distances can't be bridged." Thomas thought about that often in the months that followed. He thought about it when he packed away the last of the family photos, When he changed his emergency contact information at work, when he ran into Sarah at Emma's college graduation. She looked older, more tired, but she held herself with the same careful posture he remembered from their marriage. They exchanged polite greetings at the ceremony, both playing their parts for their children's sake. Sarah tried to explain once more, offering words like loneliness and connection and history. But Thomas stopped. 200 miles, he said quietly. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the affair, not the lies, but the precise distance you chose. Far enough to feel safe, close enough to manage. You planned everything so carefully, Sarah. Even the mileage was part of the equation. She had no response to that. A year after signing the divorce papers, Thomas stood at his apartment window, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over Seattle. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael about weekend plans. Emma had sent him photos of her new apartment in Portland, exactly 200 miles south. He noticed with a wry smile, but at least she'd been honest about the distance. Claire had invited him to a gallery opening next week. They weren't dating exactly, but they enjoyed each other's company. She understood about distance, about the space needed between people, about the comfort of clear boundaries. Life moved forward, he realized, whether you were ready or not. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed shape, became something you could carry without buckling under its weight. He thought about Sarah sometimes, wondering if she found what she was looking for in her carefully constructed double life. But increasingly, those thoughts felt like reading an old story, familiar but no longer personally relevant. Thomas touched the window glass, cool and solid under his fingers. Outside, the city hummed with energy, with possibility. He had stopped measuring distances now, stopped trying to calculate the space between truth and deception, between love and betrayal. Some questions didn't have answers, and finally, he was learning to live with that. He turned away from the window and picked up his keys. Claire would be waiting at their usual coffee shop, ready to share stories about her latest project. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had found, and for the first time in years, he wasn't counting the miles.